I know best, as former missionary to New Zealand, is going to lead us in prayer, and then we will get started after that.
Let's bow. Almighty God, you who are from everlasting to everlasting, we praise you today, and we thank you for giving us a new day of life, which is in itself a precious gift, which we so often take for granted. We thank you for your mercies throughout our lives, your protection over us, and above all for the matchless gift of your salvation through Christ, for your providence watches over us every day. We thank you for Dr. Justin Rogers. We thank you for his devotion to your word, his desire to study and to help us grow. We pray that you will bless him today. We pray that we will listen attentively so that we will be blessed. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Our speaker for this session is Dr. Justin Rogers. I'm going to begin with his most impressive credentials. He's married to Ashley, and he's the father of Caleb, Chelsea, and Cameron. Dr. Rogers is a graduate of Freed-Hardeman University. He earned his PhD at Hebrew Union College. He currently preaches for the Broad Street Church in Lexington. He's been teaching here at Freed-Hardeman since 2010. He has served as the director of our Graduate School of Theology for the past few years, and he has recently been appointed as Dean of the College of Biblical Studies here at Freed-Hardeman. The topic he will be addressing is, why is the book of Ezra written into languages?
Well, good morning. Good morning. I'm glad to see all of you here for a topic that seems kind of specialized, doesn't it? Why is the book of Ezra written in two languages? I don't know if you do this kind of thing with pew packers or something like that at your congregation, but we sometimes give these Bible facts to our children, and we'll say things like, the Old Testament is written in, and they're supposed to yell out Hebrew, and the New Testament is written in, and they're supposed to yell out Greek, and that's a great exercise except for the fact that it's not entirely true, is it? That there are two books of the Old Testament that are written in two different languages. One is the book of Daniel. In the middle of chapter 2 and verse 4 of the book of Daniel, the text switches to Aramaic, and it continues in Aramaic through chapter 7 and verse 28, which is the last verse of chapter 7. And then when you get to the book of Ezra, some of the official correspondence and a little bit of material beyond that is also written in Aramaic. And so in both of these books of the Bible, we have Hebrew, Aramaic, Hebrew. And that tells us some things about the people that we'll talk about, but it also lets us know a little bit about the time in which they lived. And so what I want us to do as we start is to think about why it is that people in Judea, where Hebrew is the actual language, why they're speaking Aramaic. So one of the things that I'll say is that in the ancient Near Eastern world, when we get to the divided kingdom period, you have a moment of time where the ancient Near East is relatively peaceful. Now, there are reasons why the Near East is relatively peaceful. It's because they're fighting on the eastern boundaries of Mesopotamia. And so that means that the western side of the Near East, where Israel and Judah are relatively safe. And it's during that time that the nation of Israel spreads its wings a little bit. And the high mark there would be the reign of Jeroboam II, who has this very long reign in the early 700s. And Jeroboam II experiences just unparalleled prosperity. The nation of Israel becomes a major travel route where goods coming from the Mediterranean travel into Syria and Assyria and Babylonia. And so it becomes a really important part of the world. And you see this in the prophets. Because with money comes corruption. I don't know if that's a general truth, but it seems to be true in history, that with more money comes more corruption, and so there's greater oppression of those who are less fortunate, and that's what the books of Amos are about. That's what the books of, Micah, lots of books are about that, because there's a trickle-down effect into Judah in the late 8th century BCE. So when the Assyrians come onto the scene, this is the 8th century, they finally shore up their control of the eastern part of the Near East, then they travel west. And so they start by attacking Syria, because you always go across the Fertile Crescent, and they subdue them. Then they go to Israel. Israel's where the trade routes are. Israel's where the wealth is. So they conquer Samaria in the year 722 BCE. And then they come on down to Judah in about 701, and that's where King Sennacherib has this miraculous experience where 185,000 people die from his camp in a single night. Now, the Assyrian sources tell a different story. Rather than some mysterious death angel flying through the camp and killing a bunch of people, it tells us that there was a rebellion back home, which led Sennacherib to have to flee, and that's the last time the Assyrians really come into Judea. But the Assyrians, when they take over the land of Israel, they have a foreign policy that says this: if we can just mix people up, they won't cooperate with one another, because different ethnicities don't mix too well. They don't like each other. And so the Assyrians decided that they would take all of these different peoples and settle them in the land of Israel, and that what is eventually what leads to the religious syncretism of the northern kingdom after the Assyrian domination, and it kind of leads them to this very bizarre mixture of various gods being worshipped. Then when we come across the Babylonians, so now we're fast forwarding to about the year 605 BCE or so, the Babylonians have a different foreign policy. Their foreign policy is, here's what we're going to do. Instead of taking these peoples and moving them into conquered territories, because it turns out people actually learn to cooperate after just a short time, and they actually get along, believe it or not. Not that we would know that from the world today, but that does happen. People mix pretty well. And so the Babylonians said, we're going to take all these peoples from foreign lands and bring them to Babylon. That way we can watch over them at home. So that's what happens, thus the Babylonian exile that we talk about. The problem is the Babylonians were not very good rulers. There was a lot of internal dissension. They actually changed the families that rule a few times. And eventually, in the year 556, this great king comes on the scene. A king called Cyrus. Actually, we call him Cyrus II because the Persians had a former king a couple hundred years earlier, also named Cyrus. But Cyrus II comes along. And you'll remember in Isaiah 45 and verse 1, there is a very interesting word that is used there where God refers to Cyrus as Ha-Mashiach in Hebrew, the Messiah. Now, that's not really the Messiah, but it is a way of referring to Cyrus as God's chosen, God's anointed one, God's providentially appointed king who is going to bring about the restoration of his people. And so whenever Cyrus comes into the city of Babylon in the year 339, he takes it essentially without a fight. And then the very next year, he issues a proclamation. This is Ezra chapter 1. And he says, all peoples who have been settled in the regions around Babylon can return to their homelands. And so the Persians essentially reversed the Babylonian policy. Rather than bringing people to their capital so that they could be overseen, they just let people go back home. And you know what? Not only do you need to go back home, you get to govern yourselves. Now, we're going to keep you on a pretty tight leash at first, but after a period of time, if you're good, and by the way, good behavior in ancient foreign policy just means paying your taxes on time. So if you pay your taxes on time, then we will give you increasing concessions. So what do we see in Ezra chapter 1? This is also reflected in the Cyrus cylinder, generally speaking, which we've heard about a couple of times this week. We find that the Israelites are allowed to go home and govern themselves, but they're also allowed to rebuild the temple. Now, that doesn't go so well because the people of the land, whomever they may have been, they come and register an objection because they're not allowed to participate. And so after that point, the Persian authorities say, okay, well, we'll stop building the temple because what we cannot have is a disturbance of the peace. In fact, the Persians valued peace in the empire above all other things. So if you ever wonder where the Greeks got their foreign policy, where the Romans got their foreign policy, they just ripped off Persia. Persia had this figured out. That's why they reigned for several hundred years over the ancient Near East. People are best behaved when you leave them alone, believe it or not. The more you try to aggravate them and impose your will on them, the less compliant they are going to be. I think that's a general human characteristic. The more you tell somebody what to do, the less they want to do it, right? That applies to churches as well as to kingdoms and empires. And so the Persians, when they came along, they basically gave the Israelites increasing concessions. So they got to rebuild the temple. 520, they were allowed to resume that project. It's finished in 515. You fast forward a few more years, they're allowed to rebuild the walls of the city of Jerusalem. They're allowed to govern themselves by the law of Moses. So the careers of Ezra and Nehemiah, while we read them as divine opportunities to impose the rule and reign of God over his people once again, from a Persian perspective, they are actually greater concessions given to the Jewish people on the basis of good behavior through the years. Now, what does all that have to do with Aramaic? Well, the Persians, and I mentioned this yesterday, Old Persian is nearly unpronounceable. The way that the Greeks understand the guy's name is Xerxes, and the Hebrews hear it as Ahashverosh. I don't know about you, those do not sound the same to me, right? Those are really different. But it's because people seem to hear Persian entirely differently. Even those who study Persian today find it very difficult. So, the Persians decided that they would use a language that had already been used by the Assyrians and the Babylonians to a certain extent, and that is they're going to use Aramaic as their official language of correspondence. And so that's why the Jewish people end up needing to learn Aramaic. If you are plugged into the upper reaches of administration, you must be willing to speak their language, and so that's how Aramaic comes to become the language of the Jewish people at the end of the Old Testament period and even on into the New Testament period. So, let's talk about Aramaic a little bit. Hebrew is derived from the Northwest Semitic family of languages. Basically, Semitic languages are, that term comes from the Table of Nations in Genesis 10. So we see where the descendants of Shem settled, and those people are called Semitic. So the term Semitic is not equivalent to Jewish, although it's often used in the modern world in that way. By historians of language, especially, Semitic just refers to anyone who is from the family of Seth of Shem in the Bible. And so Semitic languages are divided into East Semitic and West Semitic languages. So East Semitic would be things like Akkadian, a cuneiform Akkadian. You may have seen some inscriptions or something like that look like chicken scratch. That's called Akkadian. And there are some people who are very qualified in the world to read that. I'm not one of those people. But then you have people on the eastern side, or the western side, that's West Semitic. Hebrew belongs to that family of languages. Now, originally we think, although we don't have really any way of tracing this for sure, but all languages were symbolic. Kind of like Egyptian hieroglyphics. There is a symbol that may or may not be self-evident, and that symbol has to sort of be decoded. And so a language is basically not so much letters being spelled out. You can't sound out a hieroglyphic word. It's a series of symbols, and you sort of have to figure it out. Now, there's a problem with that because there's ambiguity. It might be the case that a certain word in hieroglyphic could mean several different things, and so you put words together and figure them out. I remember when I was in graduate school, a friend of mine was writing a dissertation, and his dissertation was taking 50 clay tablets from ancient Sumer and to translate them, to decipher them, transmit them, and then put them in some sort of context historically, so provide commentary. And I asked him, I said, 50 tablets, that doesn't sound like that big of a deal, which revealed my entire ignorance of that subject. And he said, oh, actually, here's this symbol. You see this symbol? And I wouldn't recognize if I saw it now, but at the time, yeah, I see it. He said, okay, well, that can have 50 different meanings. And that's one symbol in this word. And I was like, all right, good luck with that. And I decided to switch majors and start studying Greek instead, Greek and Latin. But the point is that this is a very, very technical, difficult thing to do, and we're grateful for those who do it. Well, the Phoenicians did something for us, and we're still heirs to this tradition today. They invented the alphabet. They made it possible to spell out words. So if you're no good at spelling, we just had in the local school system a spelling bee yesterday. If you're no good at spelling, you can blame the Phoenicians for that. But the languages originally were symbolic. Now, Hebrew was too. I'm going to give you a couple of simple examples that illustrate the point. So in Hebrew, one of the letters is ayin. The letter ayin is also the word for eye. Now, if you look at the shape of an ayin, especially in the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet, it looks like what's circled on the screen. It's kind of like an almond shape. So the letter ayin, even as a letter of the alphabet, still betrays its original symbolic value or look. Okay, so that's just an example. Another one is the word tav. The word tav is the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet as we know it. It's also a word that means mark. So in Ezekiel chapter 9, you remember where the priestly figure is told to go through the city of Jerusalem and mark those who are righteous. The word that is used for mark there is the word tav. Now some of the church fathers who were armed with just enough Hebrew to be dangerous started looking at the tav and they said, well, you can write it kind of two ways. You can either write it as an X or you can write it as a T, depending on if it's twisted in the inscription. And so if it was an X, the church father said, we know what that is. That's the Greek letter chi, which would be the first letter of the name Christos. And so in Ezekiel 9, this priestly figure is marking the heads of the righteous with the name of Jesus. And others said, no, it looks more like a T. They're marking them with the symbol of the cross. So either way, you get Jesus out of this. Total nonsense, by the way, exegetically, but it's something that was argued. So we can see the point. Now, the reason I'm showing you this is it would have been the same in Aramaic. These symbols, the alphabet, it's the same. And so it's very similar, Hebrew and Aramaic, at least in terms of the alphabet. Now, when we get into the language, the words are different, of course, and the inflections are different and things like that. But it's not my job to teach you Aramaic today, so I'm not worried about that. But Aram is actually the neighbor that is separating Israel from Assyria, also called Syria in the modern world. But the Assyrians were already using Aramaic as their official language at some point. And so in the year I mentioned earlier, Sennacherib's invasion of Judea, he's already taken, there are three walled cities at this time in Judea. There is Lachish, Azekah, and of course Jerusalem. He's already taken Lachish and Azekah. In fact, if you ever teach a Bible class on Isaiah or this time period, I would highly recommend just Googling the palace of Sennacherib at Nineveh, siege of Lachish. The palace of Sennacherib at Nineveh was decorated with these walls, these relief scenes from the Assyrian destruction of the Judean town of Lachish. That's something that's really cool. It also lets us in on how brutal and evil the Assyrians were. You see these men being stretched out and having their skin flayed off of their bodies. You have another scene of a person having a pike inserted into their midsection and hanging. The idea is they wouldn't die so fast. They would gradually, that pike would work its way through their bodies until eventually they died a very slow and agonizing death. Now we wonder why Jonah didn't want to go preach to those people. Like, it's good to be able to read the Bible in context, because Jonah just looks like, pardon the expression, but he kind of looks disobedient. But there's a context there. And so when the Assyrians came to the city of Jerusalem, they're camped around the walls. It looks like the city, its fate is hopeless. You remember in 2 Kings 18 and verse 26, the text says, Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, and Shebna and Joah said to the Rav Shakeh, who's kind of like the commander of the Assyrian armies, they say this, speak, please, to your servants in Aramaic, for we understand it. Do not speak to us in the language of Judah within the hearing of the people who are on the wall. So we know at least as early as the late 8th century BCE, some from the royal house, some from the Judean aristocracy, had the ability to converse in Aramaic, but most of the citizens of Jerusalem did not. And so whenever the Persians imposed Aramaic as the official language, they're not really reinventing the wheel here. They're just using what was already in circulation, perhaps for as much as 150 years prior to that point. So what is the purpose of two languages in the book of Ezra? Well, number one, the purpose is that Aramaic is the official correspondence language of the Persian Empire. So we have, it doesn't make any difference when you read these in English, but in chapter 4, verses 8 through 22, this is Rehum's letter against Jerusalem to Artaxerxes. So it's a complaint against the Jews to King Artaxerxes. In chapter 5, verses 6 through 17, although the book of Ezra is not arranged chronologically, and that can be very confusing, as no doubt many of you have come to know. But in chapter 5, verses 6 through 17, it's Tatanai's letter to Darius. Chapter 6, verses 3 through 5, is Cyrus's decree about the temple. So we're bouncing around. We've gone from the 4 570s to the 520s to the 530s. Okay, 6 through 12 is Darius's response to Tatnai's letter, which would again put us back in the 520s. And then in 7:12 through 26, Artaxerxes' letter to Ezra, which again puts us much later in time. So the point of all of this, I guess, is to indicate that there is an official correspondence taking place between the Jews of Jerusalem and other citizens back to the Persian authorities in Persia. And the whole point of this is to lend an air of authenticity to the letters in the book of Ezra. The fact that Ezra does not bother to translate them, although he could, indicates that the readership of Ezra is probably bilingual for the most part. And then, secondly, it indicates that these are real copies of actual letters and correspondence that took place. We also have in the book of Nehemiah, chapter 8 and verse 8, and if you were here at the opening lecture yesterday at 8:30, Dr. Manner talked a little bit about the ambiguity of this passage. But you will hear we actually have a whole lecture series built on this verse this week. But it's a bit ambiguous about what's actually being said. So the text says, they read from the book, this is from the law of God, the law of Moses, clearly, and they gave the sense so that the people understood the reading. Now, I'm reading from the English Standard Version. We don't actually know what this means exactly. Some people think that it could mean to give the sense is to translate it from Hebrew into Aramaic. Now, if you've ever done mission work in a country that does not speak English, you know that they usually do not like to be called translators. What do they like to be called? Interpreters. And there's a reason for that, because people who are bilingual know what most Americans do not, and that is there is no such thing as a translation from one language to the next. You're going to lose something. You're going to miss a nuance. Words do not have precise one-to-one equivalence from one language into another, and so they prefer to be called interpreters because translation is the art, very much, as well as the science of interpretation. And so maybe that's what Nehemiah is working with here. We read the law in the original Hebrew, and then somebody said, well, there are a lot of people who don't understand Hebrew, so we need to translate or interpret this in Aramaic so that more of the people can understand this. Now, this verse becomes actually the biblical foundation for a later practice. This is well after the time of the New Testament, but in the synagogue, there was a custom that was developed, reading the Hebrew text twice, and then an Aramaic translation is given once by a figure known as the Maturgamon, who's sort of the official interpreter of the Hebrew text. What that tells us is there was still believed to be a holiness and a sanctity to the original Hebrew text. What God actually inspired mattered, so you had to read it twice. But since nobody actually understood that, then you come along and you translate it once so that people can understand. Now, I don't know for sure that that's what Nehemiah 8 and verse 8 is trying to say. It could be that they're simply offering commentary. After all, this is the law of the land according to which the people must live. And so if you don't understand the law, it doesn't do much good to broadcast the law. So they may be saying, now, here's what that looks like in our culture. You know, the laws about intermarriage and stuff like that. Now, let me tell you what that means for you guys. It could be something like that. Who knows? So that's why there are two languages. People just aren't able to speak Hebrew, at least not quite as fluently as they once did. And then Aramaic being the official trade correspondence, the official letters give the book an air of authenticity. And it's more than just an air, it actually is a legitimate point. So what do we learn from the Aramaic of Ezra? Well, number one, we learn that most Judeans in the period were bilingual, at least those who could read. We have no idea how many people could read at this time. Generally speaking, people say for the ancient world, you're looking at no more than 10% of most people could read and write. Some people say, well, the Jews were more bookish than other peoples, and so maybe 20% of them could read. But even if we go with that inflated figure, and by the way, this is just a best guess. We don't have anybody saying, well, this many people could read. But there's still 80% of people who can't read. Like, that's a completely different situation than we deal with today. But the second thing is, the leaders of Judea are learning Aramaic for a reason. It's because they're trying to ingratiate themselves to the ruling classes. Now, they don't do that with the Assyrians, and they don't do that with the Babylonians. In fact, everything we know about the Jewish attitudes towards those people, they didn't really like them very much. They did not like the Assyrians, and they did not like the Babylonians, but the Jews loved the Persians. They embrace them. They appreciate them. Why? Because the Persians left them alone. Now they're still ruling over them. They're still under subjection. I'm reminded of whenever Jesus, says that you're enslaved, and the Jews like, we're not enslaved to anybody. We're free. And like, what are you talking about? You've been ruled by the Romans. Before that, you were ruled by the Greeks. Before that, you've been ruled by the Persians. You have only known domination in your entire existence, basically, going back to at least 605 or so BC. But they didn't see it that way because people were so kind to them and how they treated them that they felt free even though they were technically enslaved. And so the Jewish people wanted to ingratiate themselves to earn greater favors from the Persians so that they could drop the tax rate, so that they could govern themselves the way they wanted to, so that they could worship the way they wanted to, and protect themselves by rebuilding walls. Now, the afterlife of Aramaic. Well, there are a number of Dead Sea Scrolls. In fact, there are 22 individual compositions among the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Aramaic language. That tells us that a lot of people are reading Aramaic. This is 1st century BC, 1st century CE, so exactly around the time of the New Testament when those texts date. We also have Aramaic translations. We don't have any of them that date to the time of the New Testament, although some of them perhaps date back that early. It was viewed from an early time necessary to communicate the language of the Bible in the language of the people so that they could understand it, and we still do that today, of course. Then we have the language of Jesus. There is no Greek word in the New Testament for Aramaic. The reason for that is because I'll go down the rabbit hole for just a minute here. The reason why there's no word is because by the time you get to the New Testament, you have sort of a revival of classicism. And so if a word is not found in a classical author, that would be like Plato and Aristotle and those guys. If a word is not found prior to that, Thucydides and Herodotus, if a word is not found in any of those authors, then people didn't want to use it in writing. Even if they knew the word, they didn't want to use it in literature because it was viewed to be sort of like street language or slang or something like that. So the word Aramaic does not occur in the classical authors, so they use some version of the word Hebrew. Now, why that matters is it's a little bit confusing for the readers of the New Testament, and the ESV really messes this up, so I'll explain that. But there are two words. This is Greek. One is Hebraisti or Hebraidi. Both of those mean either in Hebrew or in Aramaic. Now, how do you decide? If you figure that out, let me know. But the English Standard Version actually in the Gospels consistently renders these words in Aramaic. But the other two books in which these words occur, the book of Acts and the book of Revelation, they render it in Hebrew. So you figure that one out. But in other words, the translation itself is inconsistent. So when Paul is addressing, the Jews in Jerusalem, the Sanhedrin and all that, the ESV says he speaks in Hebrew. But it's the same word that it translates in the Gospels in Aramaic. I don't know. But probably why we think it should be translated in Aramaic, at least in the Gospels, is because Jesus speaks Aramaic in the Gospels. There are a few cases you have of this. In the book of Mark, chapter 5, in verse 41, as you know, to Jairus' daughter, Jesus says in Aramaic, Talita Kumi, which means, little girl, get up. And you know this. In fact, the text translates it into English, or translates it into Greek for us. In Mark chapter 7, in verse number 34, to the deaf mute in one of the cities of the Decapolis, Jesus says, Ephatah, which is transmitted in Greek a little differently, but that's the Aramaic, and it just means be opened. Here's a guy who cannot hear and he cannot speak, so Jesus says be opened, which would cover both the opening of the ears and the opening of the mouth, and the man is healed and he's able both to hear and speak for the first time. Think about how amazing that would have been. but he speaks to him in Aramaic. It's also must have been a miracle before Jesus actually said that. Otherwise, the man could not have heard Jesus say it. So that's an interesting thought as well. Perhaps the best known of the Aramaic words is the word Abba, or Abba, we say. There's a band named Abba. But Abba, I've heard a lot of people say, well, that's like saying daddy. It's like have anybody heard of that? It's like a term of endearment. That's just the Aramaic word for father. So the Hebrew word is Av, the Aramaic word is Abba. That's all. There's nothing special about it. It's not a term of endearment. Why Jesus uses the term Abba followed by the Greek word pater, father, I don't really know. I'm not sure anybody knows, but it gets Jesus both speaking from a Jewish perspective and from a Greek perspective whenever he uses that word in the prayer to the Father. So, what can we learn from this stuff? The Hebrew Bible is written in Hebrew, but only about 9 chapters are written in Aramaic. Those 9 chapters are found in only 2 books. Those books are the books of Daniel and the books of Ezra. Actually, Ezra and Nehemiah is one book in Hebrew, but nothing in Nehemiah is in Aramaic, so it's concentrated in the Ezra section. Secondly, the Aramaic of Ezra actually serves to locate this book historically. In fact, it is written, the kind of Aramaic in Ezra is called Imperial Aramaic, which is just a classification of the language that fits exactly the time that Ezra is supposed to have lived and worked. Now, the reason that's significant is because you might know a lot of critical scholars, those who try to discredit the Bible, they're always trying to date books of the Old Testament later than the books themselves claim to be. Perhaps the best known example of this is the book of Daniel, which scholars, because they cannot tolerate the idea that Daniel could predict the future hundreds of years in advance, they try to place the book of Daniel in the middle of the 2nd century rather than in the 6th century where the book places itself. Well, people are inclined to do that with any book that they can, but the book of Ezra sort of locks it into that historical time period in the middle of the 5th century by the Aramaic that is used. It is very clearly the kind of Aramaic that is used in the documents that survive from that time period, so that's important. But then number 3, we learn that Aramaic becomes the official language, the lingua franca, the most spoken language in the Near East, not only in the time of Ezra and others, but for centuries after that point, even when the Greeks come in. And the Greeks are looking to culturally dominate everybody they touch. The Jews certainly learn Greek in the process, but they never forget Aramaic. They keep speaking it, they keep transmitting it, and even to this day, there are people who still speak the Aramaic language in the world. And it's because of that Persian influence that was never dropped. And so it's the language of Jesus, probably the language of most of the apostles, at least those from the Galilee region. Well, that's all I have for this session. I'm wondering if anybody would like to ask any questions that I probably can't answer. Yes?
What part of the world is Aramaic spoken now?
Yeah, it's still spoken in the Middle East.
Syria.
Yeah. In fact, there's a very small, when I say very small, I mean just like a few hundred Samaritans, and they'll speak a variation of Aramaic.
You mentioned that in the synagogue they read it from the Hebrew slides, and then did they read it from the Aramaic, or was that a interpretation for a person just speaking?
Yeah, that's a good question. So let me be clear that what I say about the synagogue does not date to the time of the New Testament. So in no way this is commentary on a cultural practice at the time of the New Testament, centuries later. But in that time period, they would have the Hebrew text that was read, always read, and the Aramaic text originally was on the fly. And that was to, I think, communicate the fact that this is holy because it's written, this is not because it's merely spoken. But over the course of time, people, they wanted to be able to read the text in the language they could understand. And so the Targumim, the translations, Targum is just an Aramaic word for translation, they were written down. And we have all kinds of them now, Targum. We even find Targums. In the Cairo Geniza, there was a Targum that's called the Cairo Geniza Targum. Because it's an argument about Cairo Geniza. But there are all kinds of things like this that we found. So it doesn't seem to be an attempt to standardize anything. Yeah. Good question, though. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Is there a canonical function for the use of Aramaic in Daniel and Ezra?
I have no idea. One of the theories about, and we don't really know why Daniel uses Aramaic. Ezra, it's easier to understand because it's official correspondence and things of that nature. So it looks like, okay, this is a guy just giving us the text of what was sent in the official correspondence. With Daniel, it's a little more difficult to figure. Cyrus Gordon, a scholar who was well known in the study of ancient Near Eastern languages and texts, he argued that it's like the Code of Hammurabi that starts narrative, law, narrative. The book of Daniel, Hebrew, Aramaic, Hebrew. Don't know what purpose that would have served, but that was his idea.
What?
In other words, I don't know. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier Paleo-Hebrew.
Yes.
You look at in the lexicon, the Aramaic section, alphabet looks identical to Hebrew.
Yeah.
When did that become the way it is?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if there actually ever was an official. It's just people got used to writing in the block. The block characters in Hebrew that you read in the Hebrew Bible today, that is Aramaic. Those characters are Aramaic. Now, we already see in the Dead Sea Scrolls, some texts are still copied in Paleo-Hebrew. Most are copied in the square Aramaic script. Some texts are copied in the square Aramaic script with only the name of God written in Paleo-Hebrew. When we look at the Hasmonean coins, the 100-year period or so after the Maccabean revolt when the Jews ruled over Judea, their coins are always Paleo-Hebrew. And so clearly people are still reading the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet who can read and who read Hebrew. But Aramaic is there from our earliest texts, that the Aramaic characters are there from our earliest texts. So they're kind of mixed.
That predates captivity?
No. This would be we're talking at the very earliest, late 3rd century BC. Yeah. And going on down in the 1st century. Now all of it later just changes where, like by the time you get to the Masoretes, there's no more Paleo-Hebrew being used. But even in the nation of Israel, the state of Israel, not too long ago, several years ago, released modern coinage in Paleo-Hebrew. So there's still that sort of revivalist tendency. Yeah.
You mentioned how Daniel isn't accurate, or you mentioned how a lot of people believe that Daniel wasn't written when we think it was written.
Yeah.
What's your answer to someone claiming that?
Well, we don't have time for another lecture. If you Google Justin Rogers' Date of Daniel, you'll be able to find an article that addresses that. It's a complicated question.
Were you saying in Acts 22 that Paul spoke in Aramaic instead of Hebrew?
I didn't say that. I said we don't know the difference. There's the word Aramaic is not there. So in the Old Testament, I referenced 2 Kings 18, the term is Baramit in Aramaic. But you don't get that in the New Testament. So we don't really know it's the same word that is translated in Aramaic or in Hebrew. And so what people are doing in translating that text is they're coming up with their best guess. Paul is in Jerusalem. He's among the Sanhedrin. This is the Judean aristocracy. They take great pride in the fact that they're restorationists of the biblical language and the tradition of their elders. And so maybe they would have spoken Hebrew. We do know Hebrew was still spoken, especially in Jerusalem among aristocratic circles. So if it is the case that Paul spoke Hebrew, he was making quite a statement. Hey, I'm one of you. I can speak the language of our fathers. I'm not just some country bumpkin who rolled into town. And so I kind of like the idea that Paul spoke Hebrew, but you don't get that from the word. It's just in Hebrew.
New Revised Standard translates in Hebrew and then footnotes
And yeah.
in Aramaic. They have it both ways.
And that's probably what most translations would do with it, I think.
So is it possible then that he spoke Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek?
Paul? Yeah, I think that's... the Aramaic I'm not sure about. Yeah. Nobody spoke Latin, right, except the military. Because the Romans didn't make people who were already under Greek control learn Latin. The Latinization only came with people to the north, so the Gauls and what they called the barbarians to the north and all that. But nobody learned Latin. So Paul probably didn't know Latin, but he knew, I would say, Greek. He was fluent in Greek, obviously, and probably Hebrew too. Maybe some Aramaic. I don't know. he doesn't use any Aramaic in his letters that wouldn't be like any preacher quoting a Greek word. It doesn't mean you can actually read Greek, but you might be able to say ecclesia in a sermon. You know
Yeah,
what I mean?
right.
Yeah. All right, any other questions? Yeah.
Like the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah.
Several of them were written in Aramaic.
Yes.
They align pretty well with the Greek translation. I know like the English Bibles that we hold today mostly come from the Hebrews or the Jewish efforts to translate it over like a 400-year period leading up to the 10th century AD. Going backward in time, like the Greek Septuagint and these Aramaic scrolls.
Okay, well, let me be clear that most of the Dead Sea Scrolls are not biblical. They're not copies of the Bible. So the 22 Aramaic compositions I mentioned, none of them are copies of the Bible. They're copies of other documents, some of which we knew before, some like the Ben Sira, for example, or, First Enoch, that kind of thing. So, yes, that's not copies of the Bible.
But now, just kind of that same whole, like the Greek Septuagint, does it align pretty closely with the Jewish efforts to bring the Bible back leading up to the 10th century AD?
Yeah, well, there again, we would have another lecture. But yeah, I mean, sometimes not at all.
I know there's a great debate over like Genesis chapter 11, the genealogy there doesn't line up right. It looks like possibly there was some.
That's a complicated, yeah, for another time perhaps. Yeah.
So were the people of New Testament times, primarily there in Judea, were they multilingual? And I use multilingual instead of bilingual because that indicates two languages, but would, because of their location geographically, because of their commerce, because of the different influences that came in, would they be multilingual, not just simply Greek and Hebrew, but would they be familiar Aramaic and perhaps other languages?
Yeah, it's hard to say for sure. I mean, it kind of depends on how much cultural mixing you want to grant. Archaeological evidence suggests that there's a lot more than we thought in the Galilee region. So the city of Tiberias, for example, would be a great example of lots of different people groups mixing together. That's not very far at all from where Jesus grew up. It's right on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, of course. So I don't know. Could Jesus understand Greek? Maybe a little bit. I don't know that we have enough knowledge to say for sure. Jesus might have only spoken Aramaic and understood some Hebrew and some Greek, but he certainly would have been better at those than most of us. Who maybe you live in an area where there are a lot of Hispanic people in your area, and so you understand a little Spanish. He probably would have been better than just that, and he probably was exposed. Yes.
So when Jesus read the scroll of Isaiah
Yeah.
in the synagogue, was he reading Hebrew and then interpreting in Aramaic?
Don't know. It doesn't say anything about translation. So was he just reading it in Aramaic? Maybe.
So there were versions of the scriptures available in Aramaic?
I didn't say that. I don't know. I don't actually know what he was doing. I mean, could he have been reading it in Hebrew? Sure. Could he have been reading it in Aramaic? I guess. I mean, we just don't have a lot of evidence of those things being available. I just don't know. Okay, I think that's probably a good place to stop. Thank you so much for being here at 8:30 in the morning for Aramaic.